They had been taught to fear American soldiers, so when one offered her a loaded rifle, she thought it was a test, maybe even a trick. She stood beneath the open sky of Texas, dust in the air, sun on her back, holding a gun that gleamed in her hands. A Japanese POW, a woman, a prisoner. Yet here she was, surrounded by barbed wire and cowboys, being asked if she wanted to take a shot at the old bottles lined up on a fence post. The man beside her wore a wide-brimmed hat and smiled like this was nothing more than a Sunday pastime. Behind her, the other women murmured nervously, unsure whether to run, laugh, or cry. She raised the rifle. Her hands trembled, not from fear of the gun, but from the impossible thing it represented. Trust, the very thing they had never expected from their captors. And when she pulled the trigger and the bottle shattered, it wasn't just glass that broke. It was the mythology of everything she had been told about the enemy. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the open field, startling a flock of birds into flight. She lowered the weapon slowly, as if waking from a trance, her breath caught somewhere between laughter and a sob. The American beside her, tall, sunburned, his hat pushed back on his head, let out a low whistle and clapped his hands. "Good shot," he said. She didn't understand the words, not exactly, but she understood the meaning. No applause, no scorn, just acknowledgement, just recognition. The others stood behind the fence, a few whispering, some giggling nervously, others staring in silence. None of this made sense. Not the drive out of camp in the back of a dusty truck, not the wide sky stretching above them without a single gunship in sight, not the way the guards had smiled and gestured for them to try. It felt like a trap. Everything about it felt wrong. Yet here they were, standing at what looked like a makeshift shooting range, with tin cans lined up like carnival prizes and rifles propped on wooden tables as casually as if this were a Sunday picnic. When they had arrived, the women hesitated to step down from the truck. The idea of being taken anywhere was enough to reignite every fear they thought they'd buried. Were they being moved, punished, paraded? But the guards only pointed toward the fence posts, mimed the motion of shooting, and then, unbelievably, handed out water canteens and sun hats. "Just a little fun," one said, as though fun were something prisoners were meant to have. The women exchanged looks. One woman muttered, "America no karakuri," a trick. Another whispered, "Be ready, they'll laugh at us." And still they stepped forward, boots crunching over gravel, pulled forward not by trust, but by curiosity. The first time she touched the rifle, her fingers recoiled instinctively. It wasn't the weight that frightened her, it was the memory of war, of duty, of being trained to use it not for play, but to defend a dying empire. That had been in the Philippines, or maybe Okinawa. She wasn't sure anymore. The lines between islands had blurred, all coated in the same blood-colored fog. Back then, holding a rifle meant a vow. To fight, to never surrender, to die. But now the weapon was handed to her by an enemy who did not sneer or mock, but who simply waited. Patient, calm. She lifted the rifle again. Her muscles remembered more than she expected. The stock pressed against her shoulder. Her eye found the crude sight. The bottle on the fence shimmered slightly in the heat. She inhaled, she squeezed, and when the shot rang out, the bottle leapt into dust and shards, the sound ringing like a bell in the silence that followed. Behind her, someone gasped. Another woman laughed, sharp, too loud, cut off quickly by her own surprise. One clapped a hand to her mouth, as if ashamed of the sound. But the Americans didn't jeer. They didn't shout. One simply handed her another round and pointed to a second bottle, a nod, an invitation. She looked down at the rifle. It was the same shape, the same weight, but it no longer felt like a weapon. Not in that moment. It felt like a question. Who are you now? Not a soldier, not a captive, something in between. As the other women began stepping forward, some reluctantly, some with quiet resolve, a strange energy took root among them. Nervous laughter, hesitant smiles. The guards, cowboys really, with their dust-covered jeans and sun-darkened skin, became instructors, coaches, even cheerleaders. They adjusted stances, mimed breath control, even handed out sticks of chewing gum, as if this were all part of the experience. One woman hit the bottle on her second try and let out a cry of triumph so involuntary it startled her. Another whispered, "I thought I'd forgotten how." A third broke down, weeping, unable to even lift the rifle. An American gently took it from her hands, said nothing, just led her back to the shade. No shame, no scolding, just space. And as the sun arced higher in the sky and the sound of gunfire echoed like laughter through the fields, a quiet, devastating truth began to settle into their bones. They had been trusted with rifles, not because they were warriors, but because someone, somehow, had decided they were worthy of being human. And the weight of that trust was heavier than any weapon they had ever carried. Before the rifles, before the laughter, before the sunlight flashed off broken bottles, there had only been silence. A silence so thick it swallowed every thought, every certainty, every command that had once seemed unshakable. It began on the day of surrender. The jungle had fallen still, save for the distant rumble of engines. Their commanding officer had vanished sometime in the night. No farewell, no orders, just gone. The sky had been hot, the air thick with humidity and fear, and when the American soldiers finally appeared, no one reached for their weapons. The war was over, or at least the part of it they had known. They waited for the worst. They had been told what would happen, how Americans treated prisoners. Torture, humiliation, shame beyond bearing. One woman whispered the word rape with trembling lips. They lined up in their torn uniforms, hands shaking, backs straight, prepared for dishonor. But what met them instead was the sound of boots crunching dry leaves. The American officer gave a single command to his men, and the rifles lowered. Not a word was shouted, not a blow was struck. Just a motion toward the trucks and a gesture that needed no translation. Come with us. It was the quiet that unnerved them most. In battle there had been noise, explosions, screaming, the constant hum of violence. But this silence was something else. Cold, controlled, and yet, somehow, not cruel. They were marched without chains, without hoods, given water when they asked, rest when they faltered. The trucks drove for hours across landscapes they had only imagined. Flat land, wide skies, towns that had never known bombs. When the truck finally pulled through the gate, the women looked up at a sign that meant nothing in their language but everything in its shape. A name carved cleanly into wood, a fence that didn't look like a prison, and a row of buildings too neat to belong to punishment. Guards stood at attention, rifles slung over shoulders, their faces unreadable. But it wasn't their weapons that shocked the women. It was the hats. Wide-brimmed, dust-stained, undeniably American. Cowboys. The guards spoke little. Some didn't speak at all. They handed out numbered tags, canvas bags, slips of paper with scribbled names. Everything was calm, efficient. And then came the most bewildering moment. The mess hall. The doors swung open, and a wave of scent hit them like a blow. Meat, potatoes, something baking. Their stomachs twisted. One woman stumbled, clutching her belly. Another began to cry. Inside, the Americans served food, actual food, stew thick with carrots and beef, soft bread, black coffee, bitter and strange, a meal more complete than anything they had seen in months. No one forced them to eat. No one shouted. The guards stood back and watched as the women stared down at their trays, some with suspicion, others with trembling gratitude. The stew was hot, the bread soft. One woman broke her silence with a single whisper. "It smells like home." Afterward they were led to showers. The water ran hot. The soap smelled faintly of lavender. Clean towels, clean clothes, beds, actual beds, with blankets and pillows. They lay down that night in barracks that didn't smell of death or decay, but of cotton and starch. And still they waited for the punishment to begin, for the cruelty to announce itself. Surely this was a tactic, a mask, a trap. They whispered to each other in the dark, unsure of what to believe. Could kindness be a weapon, too? Could dignity be more dangerous than pain? In the morning they were given paper and pencils, told they could write home, told their names would be registered with the Red Cross. They stared at the blank page, unsure what to say. Alive seemed too small. Safe felt like a betrayal. One woman wrote only this: "They gave us stew and soap and silence." What none of them knew then was that the silence would be followed by something even more unsettling: laughter and trust, and rifles placed gently in their hands. At first they mistook it all for manipulation. The stew, the soap, the calm voices, a performance, perhaps, an act put on by captors who would eventually show their true faces. The women slept lightly in their cots, bracing for the late-night footsteps that never came. They walked the grounds with shoulders tense, waiting for barked orders or the slap of punishment. But the cruelty never arrived. What did arrive, slowly and disarmingly, was routine. Each day began with a bell, not harsh, not shouted, just a clear ring through the still air. Breakfast followed, oatmeal, sometimes eggs, bread with soft butter that melted into the crust. Then came assignments: light work, laundry, sweeping, gardening, helping in the kitchen. Voluntary. No one was dragged or forced, and if they refused, nothing happened. That was perhaps the most confusing part. There were choices. The first time she was asked if she'd prefer to help in the garden or the laundry, she froze. Not because she didn't understand the words, but because she couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her a choice that mattered. In her world, choice had meant disobedience. Now it was something else entirely, something close to freedom, or at least the ghost of it. But even as the days settled into rhythm, the internal battle raged on. How could she square this strange safety with the shame that clung to her like a second skin? Back home, surrender was disgrace. To live through capture was worse than dying in battle. And yet here she was, alive, eating well, sleeping warm, writing letters. Yes, letters. Each week they were allowed paper, pencils, a time and space to write to their families. Some women refused at first, fearing it was a trap. Others wrote only brief clinical notes. "I am safe, I am fed, I am treated fairly." But over time, the words grew longer, heavier. One woman confessed in a letter that she felt guilty sleeping on a mattress while her family likely huddled in bombed-out ruins. Another wrote, "They treat us like people." She didn't send that letter. She tore it up and buried the pieces beneath her bunk. In the evenings the camp changed again. A quiet peace settled over the grounds. No drills, no shouts. Just the rustle of the wind, and once the sound of music. A harmonica, then a piano. The first time the music drifted through the barracks, several women sat up in bed, startled. One of them began to cry. Not because the tune was sad, but because it wasn't. It was playful, clumsy, tender. a lullaby to a part of themselves they had long buried. There were other signs, too, smaller, stranger, a guard who called them by name, a nurse in the infirmary who offered a blanket without needing to be asked, a small book left behind in the dining hall with dog-eared pages and a note scrawled inside, "For anyone who wants it." These were not grand gestures, but they landed with the force of explosions. They had been taught to believe that Americans were savages, that to be captured was to be erased. But nothing in the camp resembled the threats they'd been promised. There was structure, yes, discipline, yes, but also respect, even humor. One day, one of the younger women made a joke, quiet, tentative, half-translated. The guard who heard it chuckled, not cruelly, not with mockery, just laughed, a sound so ordinary, so human, it felt almost violent in its implications. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispers. What if everything we believed was wrong? What if they are not monsters? She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her hand curled around the corner of her thin pillow. That morning someone had said her name, not her number, not you. Her name. It had been so long since she'd heard it spoken like that, like she mattered. And it was in that moment, beneath the quiet hum of an enemy's camp, that the first thread of the myth began to snap. Not loudly, not all at once, but with the soft sound of a name remembered, of comfort unearned, of shame slowly making room for something dangerously close to hope. The morning began like any other, bell ringing through the stillness, boots shuffling over gravel, steam rising from the mess hall. But the guards' voices carried something different that day, a tone too cheerful, too rehearsed. The word passed from bunk to bunk, translated in hushed whispers, met with narrowed eyes and skeptical frowns. Outing. A special outing, they said. No further explanation. Just a time, a truck, and a choice. The women gathered at the edge of the yard, squinting into the morning sun. The truck idled with a low growl. No chains, no weapons raised, just open benches in the back and two guards who looked strangely relaxed, their posture casual, their rifles slung behind them like afterthoughts. Then they saw them, approaching from beyond the gate. A small group of Americans in wide-brimmed hats, plaid shirts, jeans stiff with dust, and boots that clunked heavily on the dry ground. Cowboys. Real ones, it seemed. Or at least some version of them that matched old stories whispered before the war. America as a land of wild horses, swing doors, and men who tamed the frontier with a drawl and a lasso. They weren't sure whether to laugh or retreat. The cowboys waved. One tipped his hat. Another gave a toothy grin that might have belonged on a cinema screen. Behind them, as if this weren't strange enough already, stood a line of wooden posts, each topped with glass bottles glinting in the sun. The absurdity hit like a slap. Cowboys, guns, bottles. The women looked at each other, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Was this a threat? A test? A warning? One woman muttered, "They're going to humiliate us." Another said, "They want to see if we'll fight." But no commands came, just the soft murmur of English and a guard gesturing toward the truck. "Optional," he said slowly, pausing between syllables as if trying to help them understand. "Only if you want." That word again, want. They were not accustomed to it. The Empire had given them orders, not options, but here they were, being asked to decide whether to go or stay. It felt like a trick. And yet there was something in the posture of the guards, bored, indifferent, even slightly amused, that suggested this wasn't a trap, just an invitation. Still, most hesitated. A few backed away, eyes wary, but one stepped forward. The nurse, the same one who had flinched her first night in camp when the medic touched her bandaged arm, walked slowly toward the truck. She didn't say anything. She just climbed aboard. Another followed, then two more. They sat stiffly, hands in laps, eyes forward, like schoolchildren waiting to be punished. When the truck rumbled to life, the guards helped them balance, as if the women were guests instead of prisoners. As they drove out past the wire, the camp shrinking behind them, no one spoke. The wind whipped through their hair, catching strands and flinging dust into their eyes. They passed endless fields, open and untouched, fences that marked no boundary they could see. And then, finally, they arrived. The cowboys stood waiting, relaxed and cheerful. They leaned against the fence posts, arms crossed, eyes shaded by the brims of their hats. Rifles rested on a wooden table nearby, not aimed, not threatening, just lying there like tools. The glass bottles on the posts caught the light, shimmering like something out of a dream or a nightmare. One cowboy stepped forward, pointed at the rifle, then at the bottle, then made a popping sound with his mouth and mimed a recoil. He grinned. The women stared, unmoving. Guns, real ones, in reach. And then came the question that no one had expected. A simple gesture, a nod, an offer. Would they like to try? No one forced them, no one demanded. The Americans simply waited. And in that waiting, in that strange, sunlit quiet, something unspoken passed between captor and captive. Not obedience, not defiance, but the raw, uneasy beginning of trust. The moment her fingers touched the rifle stock, her body betrayed her. Reflex kicked in before thought could catch up. Her hands adjusted with eerie precision. Thumb resting just so, cheek brushing the wood, eyes narrowing as if she'd never stopped. It had been years, or maybe just months. Time had folded in on itself. But muscle memory did not forget. It remembered how to aim, how to brace, how to kill. And that terrified her. She wasn't alone. Around her, other women held their rifles like relics dredged up from a world they had buried deep. The air was heavy with the weight of memory, of jungle firefights, of crumbling bunkers, of bloodied uniforms and last breaths shared in the mud. They had all sworn to die before surrender. Now here they were, alive and holding weapons again. But this time it was not war, not survival, just targets and cowboys. The dissonance was unbearable. 1 minute, she was back on the island, crouched behind a shattered wall, the heat thick with smoke and fear. The next, she was standing in a sun-drenched field in the middle of America, a cowboy nodding encouragement as if this were some county fair. Laughter, not commands. Applause, not judgment. She half expected someone to wake her from the dream, or the hallucination, because this couldn't be real. How could the same enemy that had bombed her homeland now offer her a rifle, not to punish, but to play? One of the guards knelt beside a younger woman who was fumbling with the bolt. He didn't grab it from her hands, didn't shout. He gestured slowly, smiling as he mimicked the movement. She followed, hesitantly, then looked up when the mechanism clicked into place. The cowboy gave her a thumbs up, and she blinked as if she'd been handed a medal. Another woman giggled nervously after missing a shot, and instead of scolding her, one of the Americans clapped gently and said, "Try again." The words were meaningless to most of them, but the tone was unmistakable. Kindness. That's what broke her. Not the rifle, not the memory, the kindness. She stared at the bottle in front of her. It sat like a question on a wooden post. Clear, fragile, asking her to do something she had been taught only belonged to men and death and duty. But this wasn't duty. It was choice. And choice, she had learned, was more dangerous than any battlefield. Her hands began to shake. She lowered the rifle, closed her eyes, and saw the faces. Those she'd lost, those she'd left, those who never made it out. A superior officer barking that surrender was shame, that to be captured was worse than death, that to fire a final bullet into your own skull was the only way to honor the emperor. But this wasn't Japan, and this wasn't war. It was something she didn't yet understand, something in between fear and forgiveness. She lifted the rifle again. Breathe in, line up the sights, breathe out. The shot rang out sharp and clean, and the bottle shattered into dust. For a moment, no one moved. Then the cowboy beside her let out a low whistle and said something that sounded like praise. She didn't need a translation. The others clapped, not mockingly, not with force, just softly, like a ripple of wind through dry grass. She lowered the rifle and stared at her hands. They were not trembling anymore, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something stir inside her that was not shame or grief or fear. It was not pride either. It was possibility. The change did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, like dust through a cracked window, settling where no one thought to look. Back at the camp, there were no announcements, no speeches, no acknowledgement that anything had shifted. Yet everyone felt it. The women walked differently, not boldly, not defiantly, but with their heads slightly higher, their shoulders a little less hunched, as if an invisible weight had been redistributed inside their bodies. They spoke more. At first only in whispers, then in full sentences. Laughter, real laughter, not the brittle sound of nerves, began to surface at unexpected moments. In the mess hall, one woman joked about the stew being thicker than last week. Another teased a guard about his accent, then froze, waiting for punishment that never came. Instead, the guard grinned and tried to repeat her words in broken Japanese, mangling them so badly that the table erupted in laughter. The sound startled them all. Laughter had once been dangerous. Now it was allowed. Appetites changed, too. Women who had once eaten cautiously, as if expecting the food to be snatched away, now finished their plates. Some asked for seconds. A few even saved crusts of bread not out of fear, but habit, tucking them away for later with no urgency attached. One woman admitted, almost guiltily, that she had gained weight. She said it like a confession. The others nodded, relieved. Bodies were filling out. Color was returning to faces. It felt indecent. It felt miraculous. Names began to circulate, not just among themselves, but spoken aloud by the guards. Proper names, pronounced imperfectly but earnestly. A name, she realized, was a kind of permission. To be seen. To be singled out as something other than a uniform, a number, a defeated enemy. One of the women even earned a nickname from the Americans, something clumsy and affectionate that meant nothing in Japanese, but made her smile every time it was said. She pretended to be annoyed. She wasn't. Small rebellions followed. Someone planted a garden in a forgotten corner of the yard, coaxing green shoots from soil that had known only boots. Another began humming openly while folding laundry, a tune she half remembered from childhood. A third cut her hair shorter, not because she was ordered to, but because she wanted to feel the breeze on her neck. No one stopped her. No one commented. That silence was louder than any permission slip. Letters home changed, too. At first, they had written cautiously, stripping their words of detail, afraid of sounding ungrateful or traitorous. But now, phrases slipped through. They let us choose our work. We sleep in real beds. I shot a rifle today. That last one was crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. Still, something remained beneath the ink. A tone. a calm that bordered on peace. She struggled with that peace more than she had with hunger. How could she explain it to a mother who might be boiling weeds for soup? How could she describe safety to a brother who had never known surrender? One night, she stared at the blank page until her eyes burned, then finally wrote, "I am not afraid any more." She sealed the letter with shaking hands, ashamed of the relief those words brought. The guards noticed the change, though they never named it. They commented on the garden. They lingered longer during conversations. One even brought seeds from outside the camp and handed them over without ceremony, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Grow something," the gesture said. "Tend it. Watch it live." What the shooting trip had given them was not entertainment. It was permission. Permission to exist without constant apology, to touch the past without being crushed by it, to hold a weapon without being owned by it, to be trusted. Trust, she learned, was a radical thing. It rearranged the boundaries of who you were allowed to be. At night, lying on her bunk, she replayed the sound of the bottle shattering, not as violence, but as release. Something had broken that day, yes, but something else had been repaired. A fracture she hadn't known she carried. She wondered if this was what freedom felt like, not escape, not victory, but the quiet return of self. And that thought unsettled her more than captivity ever had. Because if she could feel whole here, behind wire, under guard, then what did that say about everything she had believed before? The camp lights dimmed. Crickets sang. Somewhere, someone laughed softly. And she held on to that sound, knowing that once permission is granted, it cannot be taken back. But permission is not the same as peace. And freedom, especially the quiet, internal kind, is never without consequence. As the days rolled forward, something began to ripple beneath the calm. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quieter than that, like a crack spreading slowly through glass. Some women welcomed the feeling of trust. Others recoiled from it as if it were poison in their mouths. Guilt crept in, not imposed from the outside, but summoned from within. What did it mean to feel safe among the enemy? Was laughing in the yard a betrayal? Was accepting soap and stew, pencils and piano music, a slow surrender of something deeper than a flag? For women who had trained under Bushido, the way of the warrior, there was no category for this kind of captivity. If you weren't suffering, were you truly a prisoner? If you began to feel human, were you still loyal? One woman began skipping meals again, though she wasn't hungry. She had been writing letters regularly, but now her pages stayed blank. She refused to go near the garden. When others teased her gently, she snapped back with venom, accusing them of forgetting who they were. "They're just making you soft," she said. "That's how they win. Not with bombs, with kindness." Her words landed hard, because they echoed what many feared in secret, that survival might come at the cost of the self. The camp, once a place of shared suffering, began to show divides, lines drawn not by language or rank, but by belief. Some women embraced the small freedoms, writing poems, humming American songs, even learning the names of guards. Others became withdrawn, suspicious, angry at those who smiled too easily. Tension simmered in the barracks. Not quite open conflict, but enough to split conversations in two, enough to turn mealtimes awkward and hushed. She found herself caught in the middle. A month ago, she might have agreed with the skeptics. She would have called the kindness manipulation. But now, she wasn't so sure. The memory of holding the rifle, the feel of the trigger under her finger, the way the bottle exploded like a burden released. It hadn't felt like betrayal. It had felt like breathing again. Then, one night, something unexpected happened. She had injured her hand during kitchen duty. Nothing serious, just a burn from a pot handle. A guard escorted her to the infirmary, walking beside her in silence. He was one of the younger ones, with a sun-reddened neck and calloused hands, always polite but distant. As the nurse wrapped her hand, he leaned against the wall, then, almost without thinking, said, "I was scared of you, at first." She turned to him, stunned. He avoided her gaze, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't know what you were. We heard things, kamikaze, fanatics, that you'd kill us in our sleep." She said nothing, unsure if this was a trap or something else entirely. "I didn't expect—" He gestured vaguely around the infirmary. "This, you, just being people." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't sharp. It was soft, weighty, honest. That night she told no one about what he said, but the words followed her like a thread through the dark. "I was scared of you, too." In those 6 words, something shifted. Not erased, not fixed, but acknowledged. They had feared each other, and now, somehow, they shared a space neither fully understood. Back in the barracks, she sat beside the woman who had stopped eating and handed her a piece of bread without speaking. The woman didn't take it, but she didn't push it away either. Outside, the wind rattled the fence gently. Inside, the cracks continued spreading, not as a sign of weakness, but as proof that the walls inside them were finally beginning to give. The news arrived slowly, on scraps of English filtered through grim expressions and half-understood radio broadcasts. No ceremony, no official notice. Just a guard pausing outside the gate, eyes lowered, muttering a single word that echoed louder than any bomb. Hiroshima. Then another, days later, Nagasaki. And finally, the one that silenced the entire camp. Surrender. The women did not react at first, not with screams or sobs. The silence that followed was deeper than any prayer. It was the kind of silence that only comes when the world you were raised to die for no longer exists. For hours they sat on their bunks or stood in the yard, unmoving. Some wept without sound, their faces blank, as if tears were a reflex they hadn't agreed to. Others clenched fists or stared at the dirt, refusing to let the grief breach the surface. It wasn't just the end of a war. It was the end of everything that had given their suffering meaning, their honor, their obedience, their belief that they had been the chosen edge of a glorious empire. Now, that empire was ash. And worse, there was no glorious end, no noble last stand, no rising sun flag fluttering above a blood-stained victory, just headlines, photographs, and a surrender signed on a foreign ship. They hadn't died for their country. They had lived, and now they were left behind. It felt obscene. Some women tried to rationalize it, insisting that Japan would rise again, that the Americans would turn cruel now that they had won. But the cruelty never came. Instead, more stew arrived, more medicine. One guard brought a stack of newspapers and tried to point out the headlines with a solemnity that made her chest ache. Another simply said, "I'm sorry," as he handed her a letter from home. That letter sat unopened for hours. When she finally read it, the words spilled out like a wound. Her neighborhood gone, her sister missing, her father's shop burned to the ground. Her mother wrote not in poetic formality, but in clipped sentences that spoke of hunger, rubble, and the smell of bodies on the wind. She folded the paper slowly, set it beside her bunk, then went outside and vomited into the dirt. The realization that followed came with the weight of betrayal, not from the Americans, from the people who had taught them that death was preferable to shame, from the generals who had promised them victory even as the cities fell, from the emperor who had once spoken like a god and now spoke like a man, with defeat in his voice. That night, no one sang, no one told stories, but in the morning, something shifted again. One of the older women, a former radio operator, stood near the fire pit, holding a cup of weak coffee. She looked hollowed out, brittle. Then she said it. Not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the words landed like gunfire. "I don't know what honor means anymore." No one answered, but heads turned, eyes met, a few nodded, and in that admission something precious and painful took root, a shared truth. That maybe honor wasn't what they had been told. Maybe it wasn't about obedience or death or even pride. Maybe it was surviving long enough to ask new questions. Later that day, one of the guards offered to teach a woman how to fish. She said yes. Another woman helped a cook slice potatoes. A third began humming again. Life, it seemed, would go on, not as a return, not as a restoration, but as something entirely new, without a flag, without a script, without permission. And in that uncertain space, something like freedom flickered. If you're finding this story as captivating as we are, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. The trucks returned with a familiar rumble that no longer stirred fear. The guards called out names casually, their voices floating through the morning air like invitations rather than orders. And this time the women didn't hesitate. They tied their boots, brushed back their hair, and climbed into the trucks, not like prisoners heading toward uncertainty, but like guests returning to a strange kind of ritual. The cowboys were waiting again, lined up in their hats and denim, grinning like old friends. The range hadn't changed. The same sun-baked fence posts, the same rows of tin cans perched like stubborn ghosts waiting to be knocked off their perch. But everything else had shifted. The rifles felt lighter. The silence between shots was filled with laughter. Someone had brought a harmonica. Another carried a basket of biscuits wrapped in cloth. It was absurd, almost comical, and yet sacred. No one spoke of the war that morning, not of the bombings, the surrender, the shame. It hovered unspoken in the air, like a shadow that had lost its weight. What filled the space instead was something harder to define. Not quite joy, but close. Freedom? No, not yet, but maybe the memory of it, or the rehearsal. When the first shot cracked through the stillness, it wasn't tentative. It was confident, crisp. The can flew backward in a perfect arc, and the woman who had fired didn't flinch. She grinned. So did the cowboy beside her. He clapped once, offered her another bullet. She took it without words. The others followed suit. They lined up without prompting, their shoulders squared, their eyes narrowed, and one by one the cans disappeared. Sometimes they missed, but no one sneered. No one barked correction. The cowboys offered pointers gently, patiently. They did not shout. They encouraged. One woman who had refused to go the first time now stepped forward without being called. She picked up a rifle, hesitated only a moment, then loaded it like she'd done it 100 times. She didn't smile when the can exploded, but her exhale told the story. It was relief, release, maybe revenge, not against a nation, but against silence. A guard handed out canteens. A woman passed around dried fruit. Someone made a joke about turning the range into a competition. No one won, and no one cared. One of the older women, the same who had once said she didn't know what honor meant anymore, bent down after her final shot and picked up the spent casing. She turned it over in her fingers. Cool, brass, harmless. Then, without thinking, she slipped it into her pocket. A souvenir. Not of war, but of something reclaimed. A piece of herself she thought she'd buried with the uniform. Later, as the sun dipped low and the trucks idled, a cowboy approached her. He nodded toward her coat pocket. "You keeping that?" he asked. She didn't understand the words, but she caught the meaning in his tone. She nodded once. He tapped his hat, grinned, and walked away. That night, she wrote one more letter. She didn't try to explain the range, or the laughter, or the silence. She didn't describe the wind across the grass, or the strange affection that had grown, not romance, but respect, not pity, but parity. She wrote no poetry, no apology, just 3 words, centered on the page, without flourish or shame. They trusted us. She folded it, sealed it, stared at it for a long time. Then she placed it carefully in the pile of outgoing mail, a quiet declaration of something that had changed and could never be unchanged. The announcement came without fanfare, a list of names, a time, a place. Trucks would come for them in the morning. The camp wouldn't be locked anymore. There would be no more work duties, no more drills. The war was over. Repatriation had begun. They didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They moved slowly, like women emerging from deep water, unsure how to breathe in open air. Their belongings were few: a folded blanket, a pencil stub, maybe a book or a comb, passed quietly from one to another. One woman clutched her tin cup like it was made of porcelain. Another carefully wrapped a dried flower from the garden in a scrap of cloth. And one woman, without hesitation, slid the rifle casing into her pocket and kept it there, nestled close to her hip like a secret. The camp looked different in the morning light, smaller somehow, quieter, as if it, too, was preparing to be left behind. The guards stood by the gates, hats in hand, not smiling but not stern either, just watching, waiting. One stepped forward and handed out envelopes, final letters, stamped and sent, bearing the marks of places that had already begun to forget. Another offered small bags of food for the journey. It was too much. It wasn't enough. When the trucks rumbled to life, the women climbed in wordlessly. Dust curled up behind the wheels as the gates opened, wider now than they'd ever seemed before. No one looked back, but everyone felt the weight of it, the invisible string pulling from behind, not tight enough to stop them, but strong enough to remind them. The ocean was wide and gray. The ships stood like monuments of metal, waiting to carry them home, though home now felt like a word with no clear meaning. The women stood on the docks in silence, the salty wind biting at their coats. They boarded slowly. Some waved, others did not, but all of them carried something unseen. The return to Japan was not the return they had imagined. The cities were unrecognizable. Buildings flattened, people gaunt and silent, the streets filled with ghosts. Their families embraced them with tears, but also questions, suspicion. How did you survive? Why weren't you killed? Did you surrender? Shame was a language they knew well, but now it felt foreign, because they had seen something else, lived something else. And that made them strangers in their own land. One woman tried to explain how they had been treated, how they had shot rifles again, not in war, but in sport, how the men who once pointed guns at them now taught them how to aim. But the words died in her throat. No one wanted to hear them. The enemy was still the enemy, even in defeat. So she stopped trying. Instead, she unpacked her few belongings into a wooden drawer, setting the spent casing gently in the corner. Not hidden, not displayed, just there. A reminder that she had been trusted once, that someone had placed a rifle in her hands and not recoiled, that in a strange, dry land on the other side of the sea she had been seen not as a symbol, but as a person. She touched the casing one last time, then closed the drawer. If the enemy gave me a gun, she thought, maybe they also gave me back myself. If this story moved you, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what moment stayed with you the most.